Okay, I think we're live. So, welcome to the Chen chat. So, today is the 24th of March, basically 2025. As you can see, different camera, wider angle. So, I thought things might look a bit more interesting, give you an insight into my room, office, the space where I spend my whole life, just about. So, there's lots of things in here. So welcome to this Chen chat. We'll just wait to get a few people logged in. Anyone that wants to ask questions can pop them in the comments, and I will endeavour to pick them up and read them, which will be good. So this week we're going to talk about death, basically. So Jane and I yesterday were off on a road trip. We went down to Glastonbury to meet Jane's son Lloyd. And whilst we were in the car, we always do our kind of soundboarding and just talk about things in general. Part of that conversation was around what should we talk about tomorrow, or what things can we talk about tomorrow on the podcast that people would be interested to hear. And of course, as generally happens with us, whilst we're doing our kind of general conversation, Chen popped in and said death. So the word that popped into my mind was death, basically. So I said, okay, cool. So then we linked in with Chen, said, what do you want to talk about? So he said, I'd like to talk about the dying process, the whole process of somebody transitioning from obviously being alive to dying, basically, which we thought was quite good. So Jane and I said, yeah, that's quite a cool topic. I'm sure basically anyone in the physical body that's listening to this podcast is alive, and therefore we are going to die at some point and go through that transition. So it is kind of pertinent to everybody that's walking the planet. Just going to say hi to Joe Wooten, Sarah, Lisa, Jane from downstairs, which is cool, and Heather. So hi to you guys, good to see you. As I say, we'll just wait to get a few people logged on before we sort of open up with today's conversation. And obviously Chen will be waiting in the wings, generally always waiting in the wings, which is cool. So if you guys have got questions that you want me to answer, so the idea is this week, for those that are just joining, there's a few people come in as well, I can see from my end on the behind the scenes dashboard, tells us how many people are watching, which is always good. So we're going to talk about death today, the dying process, effectively. So I'm going to talk about it. I've got a story that I'm going to share, really, which at the time was quite heartfelt and quite interesting from our perspective, really, in terms of when working with people that are obviously coming to the end of their life. And then we're going to get Chen in the second part of this conversation, basically, to tell us or talk to us about the dying process from his perspective. So in terms of being in spirit, how do we kind of transition? How do we go through that process? What that process looks like? I guess what it feels like is probably more interesting. Most of us think about dying in terms of how much pain is there going to be when I die. And I'm sure most of us have probably thought about the various ways that obviously we can leave, because once we've kind of incarnated here into a physical body, we're kind of a bit stuck, really, because the only way we're kind of going out is by dying. So there's different ways to die, obviously. So hi to Vanessa that's joined. Jane from downstairs. Yeah, exactly. It's quite funny, isn't it, really? I call you Jane from downstairs because she's downstairs. So we can die. How do we die? So we can die in accidents, I guess. Which would probably be one of the biggest, numbers of ways that we can leave effectively. Obviously, we can come to the end of our life and kind of transition from a health perspective. So people that have got cancer, people that have got terminal illnesses, those sorts of things, they're obviously going to kind of see their life out in a more prolonged way, I guess. Whereas if we die in an accident, obviously we probably die quite quickly. Then there are people that are going to die in hospitals, maybe surgery, that type of thing, maybe childbirth, different ways that we can obviously pass from a medical perspective when we actually are in hospital, under general anaesthetic, etc. And then obviously there are a number of other things that can happen to us in terms of how our life can get taken. We obviously could end up in a war, that type of thing. We could end up in an explosion. All those things, I guess, sort of fall under accidents, really, in terms of how we pass. Hi to Nadine, good to see you here. So basically, if you think about it now, just while we're talking, as I'm thinking about it and talking, there's this whole kind of myriad of ways that we can die, basically, and none of us know what that's going to look like for us and kind of how that's going to be. So it kind of is that unseen thing. And I guess we're probably quite lucky, actually, that we don't know how we're going to die because nobody really wants to know what their end's likely to be like. And of course, the timeline. None of us know the timeline in terms of how long we're going to be alive and when we're going to transition and die. So again, it's probably quite a good thing from that perspective that we're all unaware of our timeline on the planet. And I guess the timeline kind of is connected to choices that we make. So if we choose to do different things, then we may or may not obviously end up in accidents or, those sorts of things where our life gets taken. So I guess if we just sit at home all day and don't do too much, we probably live the longest. Those people that are traveling in and out of planes, public transport, that type of stuff, have a higher risk to be killed in some type of accident or to end up in a kind of plane accident or travel accident or something. So I guess staying at home is the key. I suppose if we stayed at home all day and we never left, then we just die of old age in the end. so that's kind of the safest thing to do, I guess, from the conversation that we're having. But hey, hi to Tanti. Good to see you as well. So we're just going through the dying conversation. So we had a client a long time ago now, actually. It was kind of a young teenage girl, and she had brain cancer, basically. So her parents had tried everything, and obviously the medical profession had tried everything, and she was terminally ill. So obviously it was a kind of a timeline as to how long that was going to be before she died and passed. And as part of that experience, she was obviously looking for different people to try and help in different ways. And at the time, we had an old shed, very small shed at the bottom of the garden that I used to work from. So I had a healing couch up there, and Chen and I used to perform psychic surgery, basically from that shed. So this particular lady's mum booked an appointment, and they turned up. At the time, she wasn't too bad. I mean, she was diagnosed as terminally ill, but she kind of walked in. I mean, you wouldn't have particularly known there was that much wrong with her to start with, really, certainly on our first meeting. And she hopped up on the couch. I had a quick chat with her. And her mum got to understand that she'd been diagnosed with brain cancer and was obviously terminally ill. And they didn't know how long that was going to be. And of course, she was very frightened. So she was a teenage girl, very, very frightened that she was going to come to the end of her life, probably quite soon. So Chen came in, basically, and they came back for a few appointments, and he would talk to her about the process. And it was pretty obvious from his perspective that, obviously we could perform psychic surgery on her, kind of healing, really. But, Chen kind of said to her straight off the bat that he wasn't able to resolve the problem. So her time had come, and it was quite a short time because she was only teenage years. So her time had come, and she was going to pass with this particular brain cancer. But, what we started to do, obviously, we developed quite a kind of connection to her and her mum, obviously. So she was coming every few weeks. We didn't obviously charge for it at all. So it was kind of free from that perspective, because obviously we wanted to kind of help her go through this process. So what we did kind of realize at some point, as she started to get worse, she started to struggle with her hearing and her speech. And then I think she was on steroids and obviously quite a lot of pretty hardcore medication. And her face kind of swelled up, and, she started to turn up and she'd stumble in. And then that kind of moved to a wheelchair. So they'd bring her in a wheelchair and kind of bring her into the room. And what started to happen was quite unique, really, from my perspective, because I certainly hadn't been through that process with anyone before that come to me for kind of psychic surgery. Was Chen started to talk to her about the dying process. So, you are going to die. This is the end for you. And this is how it's kind of going to look. And more importantly, how it's going to feel, because, of course, she was petrified that she'd die in excruciating pain, that kind of thing. So Chen was performing psychic surgery on her to help to kind of relieve the pain, could do some pain management at the same time. But again, what he was actually doing was kind of proving to her that there was kind of proof of life after death, I guess, if we sort of frame it that way. So he's a spiritual entity in my body. He's working on her and talking to her. He was then talking to her about, some ancestors of hers that had passed that were kind of in the room. And I could feel the room change its vibration, certainly became quite cold. Anyone that kind of knows much about spiritual stuff tend to find that if spirit enter the space that you're in physically, the room goes cold. And sometimes it feels like you have like a freezer door open if you've got a spirit stood next to you, or an entity actually from that perspective. Generally there's this cold feeling, really cold, like a freezer door's open type feeling. So when Amy used to come, the room would go quite cold, and obviously we would sort of notice that there were quite a lot of spirits about in that space effectively. So Chen started to take her through, your family's here. They're going to be kind of with you on the other side after you die and pass. So, but this is the process that you need to go through. And it got to the point that she couldn't really hear from a physical perspective. So when she would turn up, the cancer progressed to the point that she was struggling to hear. She could make signs. Excuse me, she could use her hands. So her mum used to say she knows what's happening, even though she can't speak. So, and of course, Chen would be talking to her with telepathy. So he'd be speaking verbally, but she could literally hear from a telepathic perspective the conversation that they were kind of going through. And, one thing kind of led to another. And then we kind of realized this last time she came, this was going to be the last time. She was, she was only weeks away from dying, and she was kind of moved into a kind of high dependency unit, where she was going to be taken through that kind of like last process, really. And then this kind of odd thing happened. So I'm talking to Chen about it and said, well, there's nothing else we can do. And he said, well, we can create a, this was back in the days of CDs. Some of you might remember CDs. So Chen said, we can create a CD basically, and I'll talk her through dying. So when she's actually ready to die, and she knows when that will be, basically we give this CD to her mum, and her mum plays it on a CD player in the room that she's in hospital. And basically that will teach her or let her kind of disconnect her spiritual self from her physical self, and she will die effectively. And Chen said at the time, as part of that conversation, he would be the first one that would wait for her on the other side. So the moment that she leaves her body, he effectively was kind of going to come to collect her, really. So again, this was all kind of a bit risque, really, from our perspective. So I thought, okay, so went upstairs one day and just basically sat with a kind of microphone. Chen came in and he basically recorded himself taking this young girl through the last process of dying. So the last things that she needed to do before effectively the spiritual body disconnected from the physical, and she'd be pronounced, clinically dead. And then obviously that kind of spirit would move on. So we kind of made this CD basically and gave it to her mum and said, Chen's made this CD. I didn't even know what was on it. I never replayed it. In fact, Jane said the other day, have we still got the recording? I said, I don't know. I need to go back through all my kind of archives, really, of things that we've done. But we made this recording that we never listened to because it was a private recording by Chen for this particular girl that was about to die. So that's what happened. So we had a phone call probably a week or two later, I guess, from the hospice, and her mum rang to say that Amy had passed, basically. And she said the CD was played. She actually asked, play me the CD. And literally when that CD was played, that was literally the moment as that CD finished that, obviously she kind of died and passed and moved on. So to this day, I don't actually know what was on the CD or how Chen advised her to do that and how she was going to pass. But effectively, of course, it does kind of relate to us all, because obviously we are going to all go through that process at some point, which is quite interesting. So I'm going to say hi to a few more people. I think Mimi, Catherine, Rosie, and Vanessa again have joined, which is cool. Vanessa's just saying to Rosie, yep, it's live. So this is live, Rosie. This isn't recording. This is kind of real. So we're just talking about death, basically, in the process of dying, how we die, and how we kind of transition from our physical body into our sort of spiritual. And we were just, for those that have just joined, I was just going over the story that Jane and I basically had a client we worked through that was a young teenage girl that had brain cancer, and we kind of took her through that process of dying. And then the saddest thing, it wasn't sad in a way, but the next part of that, we thought that was the end, really. So this young girl obviously died and passed, and the next thing we got was an invite to the funeral, which, bear in mind, we hadn't known the family for probably more than a few months. This was a pretty condensed timeline. So to be invited to her funeral was quite a kind of privilege, really, from our perspective. So we kind of immed and ammed as to whether we should or shouldn't go, because obviously it was a family affair, and we were kind of not, we'd only known her for a couple of months, but we obviously did go. And I think her mum wanted me to read something out at the time. So again, during the kind of funeral, I stood up at the front and obviously gave a kind of a very brief conversation about the fact that we'd only met her for a few months, but she was very brave and had gone through this kind of dying process, and she'd been turning up. But the thing that Chen managed to do was actually he removed all her fear. So from the time we saw at the start, she was so fearful of dying, to the last few weeks, there was no fear at all. Chen had basically taken her through the concept that, you're not going to die. You're just basically transitioning. And that was the interesting thing, really, from that perspective. So we turned up at the funeral, and I kind of gave a reading. And as I kind of did this reading about, the work that we've done and the things that we've done, of course, I actually saw her walk into the room. So being a medium, I kind of saw this young girl walk in her kind of best clothes. It wasn't the person that we saw. The person that we saw turned up that had a huge, big sort of steroid face and, was disfigured and all that kind of stuff. But this was her kind of in her prime, really. And of course, they were playing music at the funeral, and the favourite songs that she had. And effectively, she was dancing around the room, which was kind of bizarre, because I'm looking at this audience that are all upset and crying, and I'm watching this girl dancing around to her favourite music. It's kind of a bit bizarre. So we obviously kind of kept connected to the family to a certain degree from that kind of time onwards, and certainly to her sister. So that was a really interesting experience from our perspective, actually taking someone through the dying process. And obviously, we all know these days there are people called death doulas, or I think they're called like end of life doulas or midwives, basically, and they kind of provide that as a service. They'll take someone through like the kind of dying process, I guess. So they offer like emotional help, practical support, assistance, that kind of thing, from a non-medical perspective. But their job is to kind of work with the person that's actually passing, and of course the family, which is the thing, because of course when you're the person that's actually dying, it's the family, really, I guess, that you think about. And it's the family that kind of have to go through the pain and the trauma of that kind of passing point. So doulas offer this kind of education, guidance, advocacy. They help take someone through their last wishes and needs they've got, working through like a comfort, ensuring dignity, I guess, being the key thing. And of course, it is all part of the end of life care, which is what they do: funeral planning, death care. So death doulas are, it's quite an interesting job, although I would imagine pretty stressful, because of course you're going through that with a family that are about to say goodbye to one of their loved ones, and it's going to be a pretty stressful time for anyone, I would imagine, really. But it's quite interesting. So what we're going to do, so that was my experience, mine and Jane's experience working with this person that we kind of took through the dying process. And obviously she went from a place of utter fear to none at all, which is quite nice. And I think if we all can do that, it's probably not a bad thing, really. And I guess when we start to become more spiritual, we start to realise that we do have this spiritual kind of intelligence that's in us that kind of makes us move. It kind of animates our body. And without that spiritual intelligence or the spirit inside us, then the body is just a bag of bones that's not going to do very much. So let's get Chen in to give his opinion, because obviously he went through this with Amy, which was quite interesting, and obviously took her through that whole kind of experience. So he can talk about the dying process from a spiritual perspective. We know what it's like from a physical perspective. We know we sit with grandparents, we sit with old people, we kind of sit at people's bedsides that pass, but obviously none of us really know what happens to the spirit that's inside the body that's about to transition and pass. And I think this will be the interesting conversation that Chen can kind of give us his opinion on from the other side as to kind of what that spirit goes through, and obviously how that transition is made and what it looks like, I guess, from a spiritual perspective. So I'm just going to say hi to Agatha and Jordan, who have just joined, I think, as well, which is good to see you guys. Okay, it's quite good timing, actually, Agatha, because Chen's just about to appear, so that was perfect timing. Okay, so let me just hand over to Chen, and we'll see what he has to say on the process of death, basically. Good day to you all. It's my pleasure to be able to have this conversation and have the ability to be able to converse in this particular way. As all of you know that watch these podcasts and follow us, I get very, very excited to be able to have the opportunity to converse, to speak with you all, and to provide my wisdom and guidance from the other side, because effectively it really is the other side. It's the other side from the way that you perceive things. So you're all locked into your own physical vibration with your physical bodies. And of course, there are many other frequencies that exist outside of your physical frequency. And there are lots of energies and entities that exist in that space. So effectively, it's almost as though all of you are in one fish pond and you're all of the fish in the pond, but there are many ponds and there are many fish. And the fish in different ponds don't know about you, and of course you don't know about them. So the concept is that this is how things are from a more conscious perspective. Start to understand that everything is frequency and everything is vibration. And when we start to term things in that way, then you know each of you have your own frequency of vibration, which is what makes you you. So when young Andrew is talking about the dying or the death process, death is a physical word that you use. Death, people are pronounced dead, or people are pronounced in death. It's a word that's used by the medical industry and obviously profession effectively. And of course, what it actually does, it basically describes someone's physical state. So if you have a heartbeat, you would be considered to be alive and living. If you have no heartbeat, you would be considered to be dead. And that's the way things are understood. So if we look at people that are in comas, someone in a coma has no conscious awareness. They cannot move their body and speak, but because the heart is beating still, then effectively they are alive from your perspective. But of course, we can go on to the complexities of that later. But let's just talk about the dying process. So let's talk about the first method, or the first concept really. So someone that's lived their life, an elderly person that's coming to the end of their life, most people pass and die because they have organ failure. So organ failure would be, if you like, the number one reason that your life ends. So you've lived a life, obviously, hopefully had a good life. You'd have had lots of challenges, problems and chaos in your life, because that's part of human life. And then you come to the end. And of course, as the body starts to degrade and starts to age, then of course, a particular organ will start to fail. And depending upon life choices, food, drink, those sorts of things, well, and of course your genetics too from your ancestors, this will then point to one particular organ that's going to fail first. So say it was the kidney, which is quite common. So as the kidney stops filtering the blood, of course the blood becomes poisonous to the body, basically. And then of course at some point that overload of toxicity and filtering means that effectively the heart ends up stopping. So when the heart stops at that point, that person's not really been in pain if you're dying from some type of kidney problem. Because of course, and of course the medical profession will intervene and provide pain management anyway. But if we talk about a person that's not particularly in pain, but they're in the last throes of their life, what happens? So the first thing that happens, of course, is the spirit starts to get ready to detach. So from a spiritual perspective, people talk about the silver cord quite often. The silver cord effectively is objectively an energetic connection between the physical body and the spiritual. So if you can imagine, there's not really a cord per se, there's an energetic connection between the two things. And what happens is the spiritual vibration starts to change, the frequency of vibration starts to increase and move away from the physical body. And of course, that person at this point will be probably struggling to breathe. They will start to, their consciousness will start to come and go. So people sat at the bedside will start to notice their eyes may start to flicker, their eyes may close, of course, and their awareness starts to disappear. And the people start to see them doing bodily things. People start to dribble, people start to make odd sounds, the breathing starts to change dramatically. And anyone that's been through the dying or death process with someone that sat and watched, you'll notice that the heartbeat and the breathing is the telltale sign. So care workers that work in industries where people die and pass, in care homes and such like, will know very well it's the breathing that is the giveaway as to how far away on the timeline the last breath is. And of course, at this point, many people, especially older people in care homes and places, will be given pain management and also other drugs that basically help them to transition. So these drugs basically stop you breathing, essentially. So let's get to the last breath. So a person takes their last breath. What can they see? At this point, generally the conscious awareness has pulled away from the physical body sufficiently. They don't really see anything. The eyes effectively, obviously, are, as you all know, are light dependent. So when you open your eyes, you allow light to come into your eyes. And of course, the retina and the inner part of the eye processes light. The brain then processes the imagery that the light reflects onto the lens of the eye. So, of course, what people see is this bright white light. But they're not seeing heaven, they're not seeing angels, they're not seeing anything spiritual. It's just the fact that the eye is basically stopping the process of working properly. And of course, the brain isn't now decoding the light signals anymore. So what they see generally is a bright white light. As that light starts to fade in, then of course the consciousness is pulling it back from the body. The breathing then stops. As soon as the heart stops, obviously blood stops being pumped around, and that person's energetic self, the spiritual self, now starts to really pull away from the physical body. At this point, generally, the spirit guide, so obviously in my case for young Andrew, I will be thinking this is his last breath, so I will be on hand, stood waiting, and as that conscious awareness pulls away from the physical body, some spirits are in shock, some of course are not. A person that's spiritual and understands the dying process won't be in shock, and therefore they won't be in fear. If they're not in fear, the spirit guide effectively takes their hand. They don't really have a hand, because of course you have no physical body, but essentially takes the spiritual essence and basically invites them to go through and transition back to spirit. Spirit is a vibration. I exist in a vibration. I don't have a physical body. I exist in a spiritual place. Now, different cultures, different people talk about things differently. Some people call it going to heaven. Some people talk about going home. Some people say going back to spirit, different words and terminologies, but all meaning the same thing. The spiritual intelligence has left the physical body and disconnected, and of course it's now moving into a different vibration. So the key thing about dying, really, from our perspective as spiritual people, is no fear. If you're not in fear of the dying process, then you transition generally very, very quickly back to spirit. And of course, at this point, your conscious awareness is still there. You still are the person that you remember. You still have all the memories that you had before. You don't forget the memories because you have no brain. Those memories are locked into your conscious core awareness. So you still remember your friends, your family, generally your ancestors, and a waiting party has formed, waiting for you to come. So your family in spirit know you're about to transition and die. And generally, they're effectively creating some sort of party behind the scenes to welcome you back, really, back home, back to spirit. So it's a very positive journey for people that understand spirit, people that understand the dying process, and people not in fear. Now, if the person that's dying, of course, is in a huge state of fear and shock, then things can be quite different because, of course, they'll try to hold on to the physical body. They won't just let themselves detach and leave. They try to hold on. Some of them, of course, end up actually still interconnected with the physical body. So the spirit guide will be stood there waiting for the transition. This spirit won't disconnect properly. So the spirit guide generally will try to intervene as much as they can to disconnect that person's conscious awareness and energy from the physicality to move them back to spirit. But if that person's quite emotionally strong and in a huge state of fear and negative vibration, the low negative vibration locks them in to a frequency whereby they do struggle then to move across to spirit. So effectively, they do or can become locked to their physical body. And this obviously is where we talk about people that are mediumistic and spiritual, that may go to graveyards and places, and you see the spirits of the person that died just stood there above the grave. They can't really go anywhere because they're still connected to their physical body if the physical body is buried, but they're waiting for someone, generally someone mediumistic, to come along and to talk to them and take them back through the process they should have gone through the first time of disconnecting from the physical body and moving back to spirit. Now, of course, this is where fire is so much better because, of course, if you are cremated, there is no physical body. So the physical body is burnt effectively, and the burning of that body, moving it back to its carbon-based form that it came from in the first place, basically forces the disconnection of the spirit. So even if there was an earthbound spirit connected to the body, at the moment that they're cremated and they're set on fire, that energetic residue is disconnected. And then, of course, the spirit guide is still waiting with the spirit of that person, can take them back on that journey, back to the spiritual essence, or back home, as we tend to say, but yes, back to the light, different words. So you can see the concept being the whole key to the dying process is fear. If you're not in fear of dying and you understand what's actually happening from a spiritual perspective, the transition is so much easier. People that are in fear, and of course the reason that people generally are in so much fear is because they're losing their family, they're losing their children, their loved ones, their parents. So it's the connection to other people that generally stops the transition. And we tend to find generally, again, of course, if we look at it from a sex perspective, most males generally transition okay because they don't have the very strong emotional bonds and connections that females do, especially mothers. So mothers that have given birth to children have a conscious connection and an energetic connection to the child that grew in them, and that connection will always be there. So of course mothers find it more difficult to let go, and therefore they're generally the ones that end up more earthbound than the males, because of course males don't have that same energetic emotional connection in the same way. So obviously this transition is all about the state that you're in at the end. And this, of course, is why, as young Andrew was saying earlier, people that perform these tasks as their job talk to the family. These death doulas and people that do end-of-life hospice care are so important, because as part of that job, if you can talk to the person that's about to die and explain to them that this is just literally a transition, but they need to be in a positive place to make the transition, it helps them, and of course it helps their family. Because we all know when people are earthbound, if someone dies and doesn't move across to spirit and they stay earthbound, they're likely to connect to somebody else, quite often to someone in their own family, maybe their mother, their daughter, their grandparent, or someone quite close. And then of course they have a problem where they can't disconnect themselves. And of course, they bring the life force energy of the person they're connected to down. And this, of course, can be quite detrimental to the whole family. If someone in your family has an earthbound that's connected to them, then of course there's an energetic problem, not to mention all of the emotional thought-based problems. And then we're into intrusive thoughts and a whole nother different conversation. Most of you are actually quite educated on this call and are very aware. And of course, for those people that watch this on the catch-up, you're also generally very aware of the things we talk about. So you can see the dying process really is quite simple. Let's take someone that dies in battle. So let's take a soldier. So soldiers are in a war zone. They have huge adrenaline. They have huge amounts of fear. Every moment of what they do, they know they could be shot, or they could be involved in an accident or blown up or something. So their adrenaline is coursing through their system, and it's very fear-based. So you can imagine if something happens, they get shot perhaps, or they're involved in an explosion, and immediately they have no body, the body has been vaporized, the spirit just stands there completely shocked, in fear still. So their vibration's very low because it's fear-based. They're in a very shocked state. And of course, most of them aren't going to transition. So again, they would probably become earthbound because their vibration's so low. The spirit guide again attends and tries to take that spirit through, change the vibration, move the vibration up and move it into this positive vibratory state that we exist in. But of course, as that person's so shocked, fear-based, their vibration is so much lower that actually stops them moving forward. And again, of course, they then become earthbound. So that soldier then, or the spirit of that soldier, is likely to potentially either stay where it is in a very shocked state, or again, it can connect to somebody else. And again, then they become an earthbound, another earthbound that's roaming around, connected to someone else. And of course, if you think about soldiers, they fight together. So as they all lose their lives, if they're in a battle, those that do lose their lives are likely to become earthbound and connected to the ones that are still living. And of course, the ones that are still living then come back home eventually. And they come back home with earthbounds connected. And this generally means they have lots of difficulties to overcome. because they generally come back from war with PTSD, some type of trauma, because of the things that they've seen and the things that they've done. If they have earthbounds connected to them, then of course earthbounds change their state. They'll feel fatigued, tired, anxious, depressed, all of the negative emotions that we know. And of course they come back into a family home, potentially with children and partners and such like. So this can become quite a big problem. And of course, from our perspective, anyone that goes to war, that comes home, should really be spiritually off-boarded before they come home. So if you think about this from our perspective, the way that we understand things, everyone that's been to war should spend 5 minutes in a room with a spiritual practitioner that can perform some type of SRT, disengagement, and make sure this person that's coming back home to their families and loved ones and children are now spiritually sovereign. There are no entities or discarnate spirit earthbounds attached. Because, of course, battle and war is all about fear, and fear will attract entities, negative entities too. So this is what makes it so risky, really, from a soldier's perspective, or someone fighting in a war, or of course not just soldiers, but civilians that are involved in war zones have the same problems. They're all in states of fear. They all have adrenaline running through their body, so they are likely to be connected to earthbounds or negative entities. So the same thing applies. So now just going back to the concept of death. So someone that dies in an accident, so if you're involved in a car accident, quite often, if the accident's bad enough, the conscious mind effectively has already died and disconnected from the physical body. So, of course, then a paramedic team would turn up, would try to resuscitate that person, would take them to a hospital and try to perform some sort of intervention to resuscitate them. But, of course, the conscious awareness has already left. So the subconscious and the spiritual aspect has already started to disconnect. So whilst the paramedics and the hospital staff are working on a body, effectively it is already a corpse, because the spiritual intelligence has disconnected and left. And again, the spirit guide's job would be to help to facilitate that transition back to spirit. People that are involved in accidents generally don't have fear, because accidents generally happen so fast that it doesn't give someone the opportunity to be in long-term fear. They don't have adrenaline flowing through their blood. They're not in that fearful state for hours and hours. It's literally a freak accident or a car crash or some type of crash that happens. And of course, that person literally effectively dies within a few moments. And that, of course, is actually a painless transition from that perspective, because as soon as the spiritual intelligence has started to disconnect from the physical, there is no pain felt. So even though the person's physical body may be in a mess from a physical perspective, lots of blood and bits everywhere, and there's no actual pain being felt by the spirit that animates the body, because the conscious awareness is already disconnected. And this is the thing for everyone that dies. Death from a dying process is only to do with the physical body. As soon as the conscious awareness separates, then the consciousness doesn't feel pain. I'm a spiritual entity that animates Andrew's physical body, and if you pinched me here today, then I would feel pain, because of course I'm using the physical body. But the moment Andrew comes back and takes over, my conscious awareness moves back to a different vibration. I don't have any pain. I don't have a body to consider. So pain is only felt when the conscious awareness is literally inextricably linked into the physicality. And this is the way to think about things. When you think about people that appear to be in severe trauma, generally they don't have any pain. Obviously, someone that's lost a leg will be screaming. Someone that's broken their bones would be screaming, because, of course, the conscious awareness still feels, obviously, the pain, and the nerve endings transmit those signals to the brain. But someone that's involved in a horrific accident that's not really talking, the consciousness has already started to disconnect, and, of course, there is no pain, really. So if we talk about people in comas, so people in a coma, what's happening? So the spiritual essence, the spiritual intelligence is still locked potentially into the physical body, but there's been a break. So the conscious awareness cannot animate the physicality anymore. And therefore, the medical system can keep the physical body working, but of course, the conscious awareness isn't animating the physicality. So lots of people that are in comas, the spiritual conscious awareness has already left. So effectively, that person's already died. Again, the way that you keep people alive, you keep the physical body alive and the heart beating with machinery and medical machinery. But if there's no spiritual intelligence in there, then effectively all you're doing is keeping alive a body that's already dead. Effectively, the spirit's already left and transitioned away. And again, of course, this is where we think, if we thought about things from a research perspective, a medium could go into a hospital bed and try to connect to the spiritual essence of a person in a coma, and they would either be able to very quickly talk to them with telepathy, or if there was no connection, there's effectively no spiritual intelligence in that body, and therefore that body has effectively died, and what's left is a corpse, really, to a certain degree. So hopefully that makes quite good sense to you from that perspective. So hopefully, from my perspective, we've covered the dying process from a spiritual perspective. Obviously, from the way that you all experience things, everyone will go through a different type of death. And of course, death isn't prearranged. So lots of people think, oh, it's my time. Well, I can tell you from that perspective that, again, as a spirit guide, so I'm Andrew's spirit guide. So it's an agreement we've made to work together. I can look at his timeline and I know roughly when his, let's say, chips will be up, which I'm sure he would find quite amusing. But of course, there isn't a particular day or date, effectively. There's a variable timeline depending upon choices that he makes, and the things that he does will depend upon when that end is likely to be. So if tomorrow morning he walked up a cliff and he jumped off the cliff and he took his own life in suicide, obviously that wouldn't have been the timeline that I could see, because he's intervened before his orchestrated time. And this is what happens with people that commit suicide. Generally, it's not on your path to commit suicide. Suicide comes because most people have some type of interference, generally negative entity interference, that start to encourage that type of behavior, or people obviously go through difficult challenges in their life and they start to look for attention in different ways. And then, of course, there's a whole list of things that they can do, including taking tablets and pills and such like, which, as we all know, is really a request for help. People that, if you want to kill yourself, there's lots of ways that you can do it without interfering with anyone else very quickly. But for someone that takes lots of tablets, generally, they don't actually want to die. They just want to reach out and let those loved ones around them know that they're struggling, they need help, or of course it's an attention-based choice, effectively. So people that commit suicide, it's generally not on your path, it's not on your timeline, and the spirit guides don't really have an option to perform any intervention. And again, if we look at most people that commit suicide, it's generally a mistake. They don't really generally want to or plan to. Things happen, events tend to happen, and things end up in that way. And of course, it's quite a sad state, because from a spiritual perspective, certainly it's not an ending that is particularly positive to the person that is here in spirit, because it wouldn't have been the path that they chose for themselves when they came in. And of course, generally for most people that commit suicide, it's not particularly positive for the families, because someone has to find you, someone has to find the body in different places. And of course, that can be traumatic for the whole family and for all of those involved too. And of course, if people commit suicide and don't leave some type of written note or some type of letter, then all of the family and loved ones are left in a very difficult place, because they don't know what the actual reasons were. They don't know the actual reality of why that person decided to take their own life. So again, it can be very difficult for people to move on if someone in your family takes their life and doesn't leave you the explanation. Of course, we all know the reasons. Generally, people become overwhelmed, people become indebted. Huge amounts of financial debt and pressure can be one of the big catalysts to someone deciding they can't carry on and they'd rather take their debt with them. And of course, this is a society and a cultural thing. And then, of course, substance. Lots of people do very strong substance abuse, drugs, those sorts of things. And of course, in those hallucinogenic states, they make considered decisions that aren't particularly good, or they overdose, of course. So overdosing is quite a common way that people end up committing suicide, where they don't intend to. They just make a mistake with the dosage, or they take too much of a particular drug, or of course a particular drug is stronger than they thought. You never know. When you're buying recreational drugs from the street, you never know the strength of what you take. Most people have no idea what's in those drugs either. They're looking for an effect, a recreational effect to the substance that they take. So, of course, from that perspective, every time someone takes a recreational drug, they do effectively flick red or black, because they may be taking their own life if that drug is toxic to them, or there's more active chemical in there than they expect. Then of course that could be their last choice. And of course for some people this is the fun, this is the adrenaline high that they get when they take substance. Is that, is the high going to be good enough, high enough? And we all know when we do drugs and substance, alcohol, when we smoke and things, the first time you do things you get the best feelings, and every time after that, you're chasing that feeling again. So drug addicts will tell you they never get the same feeling that they got the first time, because, of course, the body starts to get used to the chemicals coming in. And, of course, the highs get less and less, which is why people that are taking drugs take more and more, because they need more and more to try to get the effect that they're looking for. But, of course, the body starts to get used to those substances. So the whole thing doesn't work particularly well. But for someone that commits suicide, it's generally not on the path. And most people that commit suicide, again, generally are in a state of fear, so their vibration's low, so the probability that they would become earthbound is probably quite high. Okay, so hopefully we've covered various types of dying and death, really. So as you can see from your perspective, there isn't a particular choice that you would like to make to die, but just know that the dying process you are involved in. And as young Andrew took us through earlier with the young lady that we worked with, obviously what we were able to do, I was able to talk to her and show her that I am effectively a spiritual entity that comes back and speaks, and I can animate Andrew's physical body, prove to her that when she dies, she will still exist. She's only dying in the physical vibration. She's not dying in the spiritual vibration. It is a transition. This is the word that we like to use. You transition from your physical vibration, frequency 1, to your spiritual vibration, which is your normal vibration, which is frequency 2. And in frequency 2, people can't see you. But in frequency 2, when you're in my frequency, in the spiritual realm, you can see all of the other vibrations. So effectively, you can see all of the other energies and entities that exist in and around the planet, because, of course, you have this much wider vibratory scope, because you're not confined to your physical senses as you are when you're in your physical human body, because of course you're confined to your eyes and you're confined to your ears and some of your other senses. It's only if you develop yourself into more of a mediumship aspect that of course you start to bring online telepathy and bring online some of the clairsentiences, clairaudience, those sorts of things that you can start to feel and do different things with. And all of you are telepathic. Every single human that's alive, that walks the planet, that is true human and not something else masquerading as a human. Of course, if you're true human, then you're telepathic. You can speak to spirit. You can speak to your spirit guides. You can learn to develop yourself. Now, to do that, of course, that's a whole different conversation. Maybe we cover that in next week's podcast. So I will ask Jane from downstairs, because I did laugh at the wording, Jane from downstairs, to make a note that we will cover mediumship and the development of mediumship from a human perspective in next week's podcast, because I think this would be something that everyone would be interested to know and interested to hear. And I think from my perspective, it probably brings me to time, because time does seem to come so fast whenever I come in and start talking. I'm so excited and so looking forward to be able to offer my guidance that I could speak for hours and hours. I'm aware, of course, that you all have things to do. And of course, young Andrew and Jane have things to do too. But the timeline seems to go very quickly. And of course it does, my friends, when you enjoy yourself. As you know, if you're enjoying yourself, the time seems to speed up. If you're at work and you're bored and you're fed up, time seems to drag on forever. But of course, it's only your perception, because there is no concept of time in reality. It's your perception of what you're doing that either creates, speeds up, or slows down time. So you can change your timeline. And this may be another thing we could talk about on a different podcast, how you can bend time and how you can change time. If you need to fit more things into your day than your normal time clock, there are ways that you can either slow things down or you can speed things up. And that, my friends, is the chime that I hear from young Jane that's outside the door. So this is an end time for me, but it's very appropriate from that perspective. So I would like to say thank you very much for joining the conversation. Hopefully it's been of interest. Hopefully you've learned something different and something new about death and how the dying process works from a spiritual perspective. And I will say good day to you all, and I will look forward to next week's conversation. Oh, hi folks. So I'm back in the house, it would appear, which is always good. Always nice when you come back, take a breath and think, oh, aching again. So hopefully whatever Chen talked about was good, because of course most of you realise I never know what he's talking about. So I get to have to listen to all these things in catch up. So it's kind of almost like one of the students on the courses that finds out things in kind of a different timeline to everybody else. But I think Chen's idea was again to go over the dying process, death, that kind of stuff. So hopefully that was quite good. Let's go through some of the comments here. So Jordan's talking about the Academy, which is always good. Yes, the Academy, I think we're doing quite well on, really. We are making good progress for that, new website, etc. So myself and John are pretty pleased with that and all the people that are working for SRA. So Vanessa said she enjoyed the chat, which is always good. You can tell me, Nessie, what actually happened, what Chen talked about, which will be cool. I did, James saying, did you hear me tingling? Which I did, which is always good. Nadine saying, thanks, Chen. Incredible insight and knowledge of the death process, which is good. So that's it. Nadine's not in fear of dying anymore. So that's happy days. I think this is the thing, isn't it? I think when we start to understand how things work from a spiritual perspective, then of course we're not going to be, afraid, because there doesn't need to be any kind of fear around dying. And I guess I'm quite fortunate, really, because Chen's coming and going all the time, and I'm leaving all the time and coming back all the time. I'm kind of experiencing the concepts of death or how it would feel, because as soon as Chen takes over, I have no recollection of anything at all until the moment I kind of come back. So I'm guessing the dying process is going to be pretty similar from my perspective, really, that when we elect to leave and disconnect, then effectively the spiritual part of us disconnects from the physical, and then we just move that transition back to a different frequency, which should be kind of quite easy, really, because I guess we've all done this time and time again. It's just, again, that, the kind of media, the things that we read, the news, that kind of stuff, it's, it kind of puts us in a fear-based state around dying. But dying probably should be a positive thing. And I guess if we look at different traditions and different sort of native species and stuff around the world, dying is seen to be a good thing. You've had your life, you've done the things you came to do. We should kind of celebrate the fact that we've died, basically, because we've been here, we've kind of come, conquered, and then we're off again, effectively. So I guess that is kind of a different sort of narrative. I know that, with my own parents, both my parents died over the last few years, and I've spoken to them both. They come back occasionally and have a quick chat. So again, there is no real fear from my perspective, because I'm quite fortunate to know that I can still talk to them. So if I want to dial them up and have a chat, then I can. Not that I do very often, particularly, but I could do if I wanted to. But this is the thing, I guess, isn't it? That again, if we kind of develop ourselves from a mediumistic perspective, if we can talk to our ancestors and we can talk to our family and our parents and maybe children that have died, it's a kind of game changer for all of us, really, because you realise that the conscious energy of that person is still available to connect to and talk to. And this is what kind of mediumship is all about. So if you go and see a medium, that medium will try and connect you to the person that you want to have a conversation with. And the reason and the way they do that is obviously with their intention. They set the intention to connect to your granddad or your grandmother or your mother, and that energy kind of hits that person's conscious field, and then of course they can come forward and have that chat. So for anyone that's lost someone recently or somebody that's considering, there are lots of good mediums out there that can do that. From my perspective, Johnny's wife, Louise Webster, is really the only person that I recommend, because I know her. Jane's used her. We've done things with her, basically, and she's particularly good. So in terms of recommending a medium that can get in touch with some of your kind of discarnate family, she would be a good person to go to. and I can't even remember what our website is now, but I think it's something like Louise Webster. But again, I can put a link to this on the chat. So any of you that do want a reading from Louise, or you want to connect to some of your deceased family, then find a good medium, not just a random medium, someone that actually knows what they're doing. And again, there's mediums and mediums. Like everything in life, there's lawyers and lawyers, there's kind of solicitors and solicitors, there's mediums and mediums. So you need someone that's been around, knows how to protect themselves, has a good reputation, and is also very good at linking with spirit, because quite a lot of mediums don't actually make the connections you want. So if you want to talk to your mum or your dad or your grandparent, that potentially isn't guaranteed when you go and see a medium. So you need to go and see someone that is good. And I think, just going to say thanks to Agatha. Agatha's just put a link in the chat basically to Louise's website, who's very good. So from my perspective, that's the only person that I can recommend for mediumship if you are keen to talk to someone that's passed. As you can tell, Chen's been talking for probably half an hour. My voice is starting to go. So I think it's probably quite a good time to round this chat up. So thanks for joining. Hopefully it's been interesting and you've learned something new or learned something or just had some confirmation, which is good. And I guess myself and Jane will sit down and come up with a topic for next week. And if any of you have got a topic you'd like us to cover or talk about, or a topic you want Chen to cover, or something that's interesting to you that you want clarification on, I guess, really as well, if you just drop us an email to contact@andy-porter.co.uk, or just go to the website, you can contact us from there. Just drop us an email, basically, and we'll add that to the list, and then we'll try and cover the things that people find interesting. And with that, I'll sign off and catch you all again next week. So thanks for joining, folks.